Well, thanks, Petar, and I just want to start, as always, by saying how gratifying it is to be back here at Mama and in Zagreb, and to see all of you who've arrived for the symposium this weekend. And yeah, I just want to express my appreciation for the work that Petar and Tomislav and everyone at Mama do to make this possible. So as he said, this is the third year that we've been doing the symposium. The series is called Conjuncture, 21st Century Philosophy, Politics, and Aesthetics, and as Petar says, our hope is that it will be ongoing in the future. And as everyone knows who comes here, Mama, I think, is a really incredible inspiration to anyone who wants to organize, situations in which real thinking is still possible. And I think that's more important than ever today to be able to do that in venues like this when it's, I think, institutionally more and more difficult to organize that sort of possibility within the university. So again, thanks to Mama and to everyone here. On the website for this event, there's a kind of a short and schematic introduction to the topic, the art of the concept. Rather than reiterating a kind of schematic introduction today, I wanted to begin by way of example or illustration or evocation, perhaps, with an introduction in which I just raise a single example, approach the topic of the symposium with the name of a single concept, the eternal return, and eventually relate it to a particular film, Bellatar's The Turin Horse. So let me begin with the name of a concept then, the eternal return. In What is Philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari give us a theory of philosophy defined as the creation of concepts. And if ever there were a concept that was truly created, surely it is the eternal return. Nietzsche invented it, he produced it. And indeed, the concept presents itself to us as a test of our capacity to recognize its originality, its creativity, its singular novelty. To approach it merely as Nietzsche's engagement with ancient philosophy, with the fatalism of the Stoics, is precisely to fail to think its conceptual specificity. This concept is specific, or rather singular, because all of Nietzsche's oeuvre, his corpus, prepares the ground for it by creating the particular conditions of a problem to which the doctrine of the eternal return becomes the enigmatic solution. For example, the terms perspectivism or will to power exercise a demand to be made relationally consistent within the Nietzschean text, a demand which partially articulates the complex conditions under which the concept of the eternal return will have to be thought. These conditions of consistency compose a fragmentary demand for a synthetic doctrine, thereby creating the singularity of the specifically Nietzschean concept of eternal recurrence, a concept that undergoes an uneven genesis in Nietzsche's letters and notes after 1881, shadowing its inchoate development in his published books. But we know, because Nietzsche tells us, and because Pierre Klasowski, in Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle, reconstructs this telling, that the eternal return is also the name of an experience. It is something that happens to Nietzsche, something that overtakes him. It emerges as a concept through a mood or Stimmung that gives way onto an experience of thought, the experience of thinking itself, perhaps even an experience of the identity of thinking and being. Thus, while we can say that Nietzsche creates the concept of the eternal return, we can also say that he discovers it, that he happens upon it since it happens to him. And because it happens to him, Nietzsche becomes the name of this discovery of its event, the event of the conceptual occurrence of the eternal return. Nietzsche is the name of the taking place of a concept in the history of philosophy, just as it is the name of he who creates the concept by articulating the conditions of its consistency. But when does the eternal return take place, and where? We are in a position to respond to these questions with answers that are at once exact and ambiguous, answers which are clear, confused, or distinct, obscure, as Deleuze might say. We could say, first of all, that the event concept of the eternal return takes place in and through Nietzsche in August of 1881 at Zielsmaria. Here Nietzsche undergoes an experience which puts him in advance of other men, he says. The intensity of this experience makes him shudder and laugh and weep with joy, and it gives rise to the idea, he says, that he is living an extremely dangerous life because he is, quote, one of those machines which can explode, unquote. At Ziels Maria, in 1881, the experience of the eternal return brings Nietzsche to the brink of an explosion which he does not yet undergo. And thus he remains Nietzsche, the thinker who now fears and desires the creation of a concept, and who begins to outline its contours, if only in the most elliptical fashion. He's the author, for example, of Zarathustra. But we could also respond to these questions. When does the eternal return take place, and where? By saying, January of 1889 in Turin. That is when and where the experience of the eternal return truly overtook Nietzsche, where it well and truly occurred. And it is because this finally happened that he was no longer able to remain Nietzsche. He went mad, we say. Then and there he became another, unknown to himself and to us, dissolved into the insoluble labyrinth of a concept he could not find his way out of, or to return to his own metaphor, the machine had exploded. So the problem of the eternal return, the eventual taking place of the concept, is displaced in both space and time. It has the structure of a trauma, dislocated between two events that destabilize and dislodge the principle of identity according to which we could assign the creator of the concept a name, Nietzsche. The discovery or creation of the concept is the disjunctive synthesis through which Nietzsche at once becomes who he is and who he is not, through which he becomes who he cannot be. The condition of thinking the concept is the destruction of its thinker. The incoherence of the thinker is the condition of the coherence of the concept. This is a paradox which Nietzsche, the danger of which Nietzsche recognized as soon as he began to think the eternal return. For the philosopher named Nietzsche, thinker of the eternal return, this was first of all a pedagogical problem, a problem of transmission, which was also the rhetorical mime of a real danger, that of psychosis. Nietzsche could not teach the doctrine of the eternal return, and indeed he could only speak of it in hushed tones, hiding its real consequences for thought, even as he tried to convey them. In other words, philosophy could not quite include the concept of the eternal return. Only in Klosowski's extraordinary book do we begin to find the proper determination of the concept, and this is not quite a work of philosophy, but rather one of commentary. Here we are not concerned with the creation of concepts, but rather with commentary upon a concept already created or discovered. So again, we are confronted with a paradoxical situation. A commentary upon the concept precedes its production. It is the torque of this paradox that lends Klosowski's book its incredible force and makes it hard to assign a genre. To be sure, Nietzsche's oeuvre constructs the conditions of possibility for Klosowski's articulation, for his strange book, whose true topic, he says, is not Nietzsche's philosophy, but Nietzsche's brain. The thought of the eternal return traversed the physiology, or aphysiology, and found itself lodged within an organ that could not ultimately accommodate its visitation. Nietzsche's body becomes the unstable host of a dangerous parasite, the concept of the eternal return. In this case, then, the paradoxical condition of conceptual production is that the corpus of the philosopher must create the parasite of which it is the host. And this is what Nietzsche could not quite do, although, nevertheless, it somehow happened. The concept is a parasite upon the corpus of philosophy. This is what the history of the concept of the eternal return, written by Klosowski, makes clear. The philosopher can only create the concept on the paradoxical condition of already having become its host. Isn't this what Hegel is telling us about the relation of art to the concept, when, in his lectures on aesthetics, he describes the work of art as, quote, a development of the concept out of itself, a shift in the concept from its own ground to that of sense, through which the concept becomes, he says, the power and activity of canceling again the estrangement in which it gets involved. So, the question is philosophy the only medium that can host the concept, which can host its creation? In the case of the eternal return, the brain proves too fragile a medium to sustain this creation, and the language of philosophy proves an inadequate medium for its transmission. The doctrine of the eternal return could not be transcribed in philosophy. It could only be related as a kind of history, histoire, a story told by Klosowski. The conceptual doctrine gives way to narration, philosophical commentary in the mode of detective fiction, or perhaps that of a cautionary fairy tale called Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle, like Snow White and the Seven Dwarves. To return to art, to the art of the concept, perhaps it is possible that the story of this concept can be told in a different way, given other names and even assigned another protagonist. This is what happens in Béla Tarr's final cinematic masterpiece of 2011, The Turin Horse. The title already gives us a clue as to how the film will handle what Deleuze calls conceptual personae. The title of the film seems to present a subject and a predicate, a horse from Turin. But it turns out that this is not really the case. All of the descriptions of the film say in 1889, Nietzsche saw a horse being whipped in Turin, broke down in tears, flung his arms around the horse, and subsequently went mad. And now Béla Tarr has made a film not about Nietzsche, but about the horse. But then it turns out that the people in this film are speaking Hungarian, not Italian. This is the Turin horse, but it is not exactly a horse from Turin. Indeed, the house and the stable in which the bulk of the film takes place was built by the crew, which is just to say, after all, that we are watching a movie. So the Turin horse is not really the name or the description of a horse. It is the name of an episode, the famous story of how something happened both to a horse and to Nietzsche. It is the name of an event which has to be related to us as a story, the story of the consummation of the thought of the eternal return in human madness, which is also the story of the whipping of an animal by the driver of a hansom cab, an iconic bourgeois conveyance, in the streets of a northern Italian industrial city in the late 19th century. Abstracting from this horse, or this city, perhaps we could say that this is a story about the incompatibility of the city and the animal, the incompatibility of capitalism and the animal, of modernity and the animal, an incompatibility mediated not only by money, but by man and his destiny, madness, his destiny precisely because of these incompatibilities. The eponymous episode of 1889, The Turin Horse, is precisely contemporaneous with the first commercial production of the automobile, which will replace the horse and buggy. And it is precisely contemporaneous with the inaugural film shot with a motion picture camera. The episode situates us in 1889 on the cusp of the 20th century as its proleptic thinker, Nietzsche, is undone by a spectacle of cruelty that somehow manages to be at once trans-historical and characteristically modern. So how does Béla Tarr relate what he draws from this episode? Frame by frame, first of all, as cinema must. A concatenation of still images thrown into time and projected. The formal iterability of difference and repetition. Film, not philosophy, becomes the veritable medium of the eternal return, the circular temporality of which it cuts up, selects, distributes, draws out on a line, and coils into a reel, split, staggered, and synthesized. The film begins with a virtuosic long take, a horse running, whipped, pulling a wagon, carrying a man. The horse gnaws at a metal bit, and it wears blinders, so that if it looks to either side, it sees only black. This is how cinema charges through time. In addition to the horse, the film has two main characters, a man and a woman who live in a simple stone house. The virtually wordless representation of their daily gestures is punctuated by a single monologue, that of a visitor who offers a pessimistic commentary upon the animal called man, a worthless creature dominated by greed and vanity who degrades everything he touches. In other words, the sort of commentary upon man we might find in Nietzsche's oeuvre. Man, animal, and modernity, the last term determining the relation, coming to determine the relation between the first term, man, and the second, animal. This is the implicit system of a scenario, a man who owns a cab drawn by a horse, which implicates us in two stories. First, the cruel exploitation of animal by man. Second, the cruelty, stupidity, and meaninglessness of capitalist modernity, which comes to determine man's differentiation from the animal as a disaster. These are the two stories conjugated by the episode called The Turin Horse, of which Nietzsche was at once the witness and the protagonist. Their conjunction is what he encounters in Turin, the affirmation of this encounter, of every event which leads to it and follows from it, is what would have to be affirmed in order to affirm the eternal return, the differentiation of man and animal, which opens onto the possibility of conceptual thinking, and the nihilism of capitalist modernity, which ends in catastrophe. Did Nietzsche go mad because he achieved this affirmation, or because he was incapable of it at the decisive moment? This is admittedly a ridiculous question which can never be answered and should probably not even be asked, which is why we have to return not to Nietzsche, the philosopher, but precisely to the Turin Horse, the event. This is the return performed by Tara's film, which does not quite narrate the event, but rather its implications. The narrative moves across a number of days, each one giving its own intertitle: the first day, the second day, the third day, the fourth day, the fifth day. And the film gives us a lesson in perspectivism. Each day, we watch two people eat 2 potatoes at a table with 4 sides. And the camera moves around the sides of the table, one each day, until we have viewed the figures eating from all 4 angles, plus 1, a repetition. The camera is a perspectival machine, and this differential repetition of the same scene across 5 days from 4 different angles, plus 1 return to a same angle, is a unitary structural principle, through which it is emphasized that these 5 days are included in one film or one form, and that the day is merely a narrative fiction of the medium of its content. And indeed, by the end of the film, it seems that the sun has burnt out, or at least it is no longer shining. Sometime during the 4th day, darkness falls once and for all. The word day names a cyclical relation of the earth to the sun, but from the perspective of the sun, after all, there is only one day, and by the end of the film, that day is over. From the perspective of eternity, subspecies aeternitatis, the cyclical division of time has no significance at all. The film ends in darkness, and not even the lamps will light. The laws of nature have changed, the horse has stopped eating, the well has run dry, and there is no longer any fire with which to boil the potatoes. Now the temporal repetition of one frame after another returns us to the same image, which is not really quite an image, nor the negation of an image, but the sensible absence of an image. Black, 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 black. Like a horse looking sideways at blinders. This is how the film ends. Having traversed Nietzsche's brain, a machine that can explode, the inchoate concept of the eternal return is transferred after the explosion onto celluloid and transmitted as a complex image. Just as Deleuze says, philosophy is the creation of concepts, art is the creation of percepts and affects, sensations. Except that the eternal return, precisely the concept which Deleuze, after Nietzsche, tried to think, shows us that philosophy is not quite sufficient to create the concept, but somehow both hosts and inaugurates its concatenated historical production. It would be going too far to say that the thought of the eternal return or its explosion in Turin is a proleptic anticipation of cinema. But it would not be going too far to say that the production of that dangerous machine, Nietzsche's brain, and of the cinematic apparatus share the same historical conditions of possibility, and that the destruction of one and the creation of the other converge around 1889. This is the sort of thing that you have to be concerned with if you make a film about the Turin Horse. It's the impossibly complex affirmation of all the conditions of possibility which produce this convergence, which would have to be thought in the name of the eternal return. It goes without saying that no single apparatus, organic or mechanical, philosophical or cinematic, is capable of that. And this is the impossibility that Nietzsche suffered. It is the Turin Horse, Tara's film, which tells something like the story of this impossibility in the most occluded fashion, just as Nietzsche whispers his doctrine to those who can barely hear it and who mistake it for what it is not. When Hegel tells us that art is conceptual and that philosophy and art are indeed opposed, but only insofar as they are two differential grounds upon which the concept pursues its productive articulation through the sublation of their opposition. He is telling us that the concept produces itself as thought and sensation, though it is differentially included in art and philosophy. To think the art of the concept is to think the problem of this differential inclusion and to understand its ground, which is the necessary insufficiency of any discrete apparatus to include the whole of a concept, of the concept, an insufficiency which Hegel's philosophy also runs up against and which the concept of the eternal return makes clear. Luckily for us, that insufficiency allows us to pursue the productive co-articulation of philosophy, literature, music, film, and visual art, and to do so in what I'm sure will be some very different ways over the course of the weekend. So again, thanks. And